It's Zombies Ate My Neighbors, a 1993 overhead run-and-gun developed by LucasArts, and oddly enough, published by Konami. This horror-themed classic is the brainchild of LucasArts game artist Mike Ebert, who was inspired by arcade cabinets like Robotron and Smash TV. Ebert created an action game aesthetically rooted in classic American horror movies, but with an emphasis on finding and rescuing people in danger instead of combat alone. Tension in the game was intended to be elevated not only from the hordes of fast-moving monsters on screen, but also the need to strategically manage your limited arsenal of weapons, a game mechanic that would become central to the survival horror genre of the late 90s and early 2000s. So, was he successful? Absolutely! Zombies Ate My Neighbors, in my opinion, is one of the best games on the Super Nintendo, and easily my first choice for a retro video game session during the Halloween season. It's easy to pick up and play, it's two-player simultaneous co-op, and it's simple and intuitive enough that virtually any friend or family member can join in. Yet it's also complex enough to keep experienced gamers coming back in order to attempt to either best their high score or to try to actually complete the game, which I'm almost certain is impossible to do. Zombies Ate My Neighbors was originally developed for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, but a Sega Genesis port was started and completed close on the heels of the original. Both games play very similarly, but I'm inclined to consider the Super Nintendo version definitive. The music and sound effects just sound more crisp and clear on the Super Nintendo, and I prefer the controller layout by a wide margin. There's no real need to explain this game. Zombies, monsters, and aliens are on the loose for some reason, and you have to save all 10 of your neighbors from certain death by killing monsters with a water gun and bumping into people the same way Mario picks up mushrooms. Boop boop boop, boop, boop 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 boop, boop boop boop, boop boop. Gameplay moves extremely quickly through a relatively large set of maze-like levels. You can pull out a radar screen to help give you a general idea of where you might find people in need of rescue, but getting those blips isn't often very straightforward. Usually, you're gonna have to find a roundabout way to get there, or find a key. This doesn't usually take that long, but you're bound to do a fair amount of backtracking and exploring. There are well over 50 levels of gameplay, which seems staggering, but some levels can be beaten in less than 5 minutes, and after a certain point, the levels simply repeat with harder enemies. You get a lot of different weapons and secondary item variations in this game, but as with most games of this kind, they aren't all created equal. The rocket launcher is very disappointing, since it not only kicks you back every time you use it, making it very difficult to control, but you can never tell if it actually hits your enemy. There's no explosion! I'd expect a weapon like this to decimate the screen, but not really. Other weapons, like bombs, feel useless because they're slow to use and don't have a large enough diameter for causing damage. There's also these projectiles that fly in an arc and are very hard to hit enemies with. You can also throw plates, knives, and freeze your enemies with a fire extinguisher, all of which are actually very fun and effective to use. But the Weed Whacker is completely, and I mean totally, badass!
Die, 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 you zombie bastards! Get him!
The only problem is that it doesn't cut through the hedge maze, and that is a missed opportunity. Some of the secondary items are just as baffling, such as these clown bop-em toys that you can leave as a decoy. I guess the idea is that by dropping them, enemies will gravitate towards them instead of you, but it only works about half the time, and only for enemies that are on screen. It's just much easier to simply run away. The potions that turn you into a monster, however, are simply awesome, granting you invincibility and the ability to smash through certain walls. Sadly, this incredibly useful item is few and far between. Really, there are a ton of weapons and items in this game. Some very good, some not so good. You figure out what works through trial and error. Many people cite the best way to play this game is in the two-player co-op, which I think is true, as a social experience with friends. But the game really can be just as fun by yourself, and honestly, Perhaps it's a bit easier, since you're not constantly hampered by the second player getting stuck behind you somewhere on the screen. There seems to be a lot more weapons and items to go around too. It is obvious to me that this game was truly a passion project, and there are so many charming little touches that make playing it a joy. The enemy designs are especially inspired. Enemies like little axe-wielding dolls that come to life off the shelves of the department store. And my favorite, the chainsaw-wielding maniac who will chase you by actually cutting through the walls of the hedge maze. In fact, the only way to beat the level is to encourage them to do so. The only problem with this is that more often than not, you're also going to lose your neighbors. The music is also inspired. Some is reminiscent of a kind of psychotic circus, but most of it is a kind of homage to 60s surfer rock and 50s sci-fi horror movies. It is absolutely perfect. Like I said, this is an arcade-style action game, so the emphasis is more on high scores and pick-up-and-go fast-paced gameplay. And that being said, I dare anyone to actually complete this game. It's harder than hell. Like, maybe impossible hard. These giant babies, for instance, are virtually impossible to work with, as they sort of randomly bounce all over the screen, doing massive damage. There is a password system allowing you to continue the game from any of the levels, but just start off with just the water gun. So yeah, right. There's just no way you can handle these later enemies like giant ants and giant babies or UFOs with no weapons. Also, technically, in order to 100% the game, you'd have to be able to save all 10 victims in every level, every time. But as soon as you lose one, that's it. They're gone for the rest of the game. It's impossible! But then 100%ing this game isn't why or how the game was designed this way. This was designed as an action arcade game, and it's meant to deliver a virtually infinite progressive challenge experience. The designers are perfectly aware that this game is impossible. In fact, they are essentially daring you to actually attempt to beat it. And I'm sure maybe some crazy person has. But that won't be you. It certainly wasn't me. We give Zombies Ate My Neighbors a must-play rating for the Halloween season, especially since the game can still be purchased for either the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis at a relatively decent price. But seriously, here is a game that is just begging for a contemporary remake. So, what do you all think about Zombies Ate My Neighbors? Do you like to play it on Halloween? Also, what other retro games do you play this time of year? We'd love to hear back from you in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye now.